Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm a teacher and author, and this is English Nerd. Just a reminder, if you have enjoyed the hundreds of other educational videos on this channel, please consider leaving me a tip with the super thanks down below, or head over to my website at carly-stevens.com for additional resources, including an entire teaching unit on Picture of Dorian Gray, as well as a Dorian Gray reader, which is the complete text of the book with paired readings as well. So all kinds of good stuff over there. Head on over if you're interested. All right, so let's get into it. Today I'm going to talk about the Picture of Dorian Gray, Chapter 2. Chapter 2 I'm taking by itself just because it is such a pivotal chapter in this story. If you look at a plot structure chart, for example, this would be the inciting incident. We had the introduction, we met some characters in the first chapter, we got a sense of where we are, who the players are, maybe some of the themes and tone, but in the second chapter we get the catalyst for everything that's going to come after. So let's talk about it. I'm going to focus on this chapter in terms of three things. So one, beauty. It's a central theme in the entire work, and in fact all of Oscar Wilde's work and life philosophy, but it really comes through clearly here in chapter 2. Two, temptation, the nature of temptation, because we see Lord Henry acting as this kind of devil on Dorian's shoulder, tempting him toward this dissolute life that's going to consume him here very shortly. And then finally, the Freudian idea of id, ego, and superego. It's another way of looking at these three characters that are in the story so far and how they interact with each other. So I'm going to make some other observations, some summary and all of that, but just be aware those are going to be the three kind of main touchstones that I keep returning to for chapter 2. All right, so at the end of chapter 1, we hear that Dorian Gray himself, that Lord Henry and Basil Hallward have been discussing, is here to sit for his portrait. Basil is the artist, Lord Henry is his friend, and Dorian Gray is this young, beautiful gentleman that is Basil's muse. Just a note about the name Dorian Gray. In this story, Wilde is almost Dickensian in the way that he uses names to really give you a sense of character. I don't think he does this with every character, but he very certainly does this with certain ones throughout the story. So Dorian Gray. Dorian is, besides being just a beautiful name, in my opinion, a mode of music as well. It is, according to Plato in his Republic, a sort of warlike, you know, rousing, inspiring mode. I'm not sure that the particular kind is as important. It's just the fact that Dorian, you can have music in the Dorian mode, and that seems to really gel with his artistic inspiration, kind of hedonistic, I mean, not that music's hedonistic, but, you know, just this sense of beauty and luxury and things like that. So Dorian, and then of course Gray is that, you know, it's not black and it's not white, it's somewhere in between. And we see that kind of morally that is, at least initially, where he sits. All right, so here is Dorian. He is playing he's looking at piano music when they first walk in, and, you know, again, that connection to music with him and beauty. He's looking at Schumann's Forest Scenes, which is a lovely piece. You can find it on, you know, you can listen to it if you like. I have, it's very nice. So I'm just going to take a look at the first physical description that we get of Dorian, because his physical description is central to not only his character, but the book as a whole. Obviously, the Picture of Dorian Gray captures only his physical appearance. So it says, so Lord Henry looked at him. So it's through Lord Henry's eyes at first, which is interesting. Yes, Dorian was certainly wonderfully handsome, with his finely curved scarlet lips, his frank blue eyes, his crisp gold hair. There was something in his face that made one trust him at once. All the candor of youth was there, as well as all youth's passionate purity. One felt that he had kept himself unspotted from the world. No wonder Basil Hallward worshipped him. It's such an interesting kind of description. We get this level of itemization that is often reserved for women in books, right? You know, prized for their kind of external beauty, but here we have it applied to this young man through the eyes of Lord Henry. A couple of interesting things to note here in this description, besides his extraordinary personal beauty, is that there was something in his face that made one trust him at once. There's this kind of youthful openness. So not only is he good looking, but it's not that kind of good looking that makes you kind of distrust somebody, like, oh, I don't know, maybe they're you know, flirting with everyone, or, you know, there's this openness about him that makes it so that you just are drawn to him, you want to trust him, you feel that there's a kind of purity there that goes beyond that skin deep level. So there is a history of beauty being perceived this way as being almost equivalent with good. If you look at illustrations of children's fairy tales from way back when, for example, the good characters are always, you know, cherubic and lovely, and the evil characters are always gnarled and ugly in some way. There was even a kind of pseudoscience at one point where people would take measurements of the skull, and if it was deformed in any way, then there was a moral deformity that was kind of associated with that physical deformity. That has since been wildly debunked. But we have some of the vestiges of this same concept happening here. It would be difficult for Lord Henry to imagine that Dorian could do something evil. He sees that. So there's a sort of connection, at least initially, between physical and sort of moral beauty. That is not going to be the case throughout the rest of the story. But we do initially see that. Okay, so Lord Henry, one of the very first things that he says, we want to watch this interaction very closely. The chapter is mostly Lord Henry and Dorian interacting with each other. It is Lord Henry influencing Dorian. So one of the first things Lord Henry says is, "You are too charming to go in for philanthropy, Mr. Gray. Far too charming." So you're too charming to be good is essentially what he's saying to you know, give to the less fortunate, like leave that to other people. You have much more before you is kind of the assumption here. You have other things you could be doing that are more interesting or better, or, you know. So you can start to read into even this first comment by Lord Henry that he is trying to kind of get into Dorian's mind that he is above a lot of other things, that he is capable of many other things, that he should be, you know, looking out for himself, taking advantage of that charm and that beauty that he has. Basil, as he's getting ready to do some painting, you know, of course, Dorian is here to sit for that portrait, is concerned by this comment. And he knows Lord Henry as well. He knows that Lord Henry is manipulative. We saw that at the end of chapter 1 when he gives that admonition about how Lord Henry's influence would be bad. So Basil says, "Harry, I want to finish this picture today. Would you think it awfully rude of me if I asked you to go away?" And Henry says, "Am I to go, Mr. Gray?" So there are a few things here that I want to point out. So Basil is concerned about the level of influence that Henry can have over Dorian. I doubt that he liked that comment very much. You're too charming to be good. I think he probably was a little afraid of where that whole idea was going. And then Henry immediately, instead of responding to Basil and respecting his friend and saying, sure, you know, I'll come back later. He looks at Dorian and says, should I go? He gives this level of control to Dorian that he's later going to really amplify the idea that Dorian has this ultimate control over his own actions and his own destiny. And he's just sowing a bunch of little seeds here in their first moments together. So am I to go? As if Dorian is the one in control. Because he knows that he is. Basil has confessed that he, quote unquote, worships, idolizes Dorian, and whatever Dorian says goes. And Henry, as a student of people, is fully aware of this, and so he, in order to stay, pretends to give Dorian the control, when really Henry knows what Dorian's probably going to say, and gets what he wants through asking Dorian instead of Basil. So Dorian says, no, you can stay. That is perfectly fine. So before we go any further, I wanted to go back to that idea of the id, ego, superego. It's the idea that the ego is kind of your core, basic, external facing self. You have the id, which is the deep desires, the you know, the kind of, if you're looking at like head, chest, stomach of Plato's soul, it's a very similar idea. So the id would be the stomach, the part of oneself that is selfish, that is greedy, that is, you know, controlled by the basest of desires. And then the superego is like a conscience. It's that part of you that, you know, makes you feel guilty for doing the wrong thing, or leads you toward perhaps doing the right thing even if you don't really feel like doing it. So in this case, we have Dorian kind of in the center as the ego between a superego-like figure with Basil, who is, you know, pure of heart. Maybe he has his flaws as well, but he is essentially someone who wants good for others and wants to do good. And then we have Lord Henry, who is playing to those base desires, and we're going to see that more and more throughout this chapter. So he's our id over here. All right, so carrying on. So I've already established that Lord Henry is this bad influence. Basil reiterates this in front of Dorian, and yet even so, even before Lord Henry and Dorian have any alone time together, which they will in a moment, it says Lord Henry is somebody to whom Dorian had rather taken a fancy. He's intrigued by Lord Henry. He's very, very different than Basil, his friend. So he is so unlike Basil, he thinks. They made a delightful contrast, and he, Lord Henry, had such a beautiful voice. After a few moments, he said to him, "Have you really a very bad influence, Lord Henry, as bad as Basil says?" So Dorian is very curious. This is an early step in temptation. If you see the temptation of Eve in Paradise Lost, if you see the temptation of, I don't know, Faust and Dr. Faustus, if you see the temptation of Don Juan in Lord Byron's poem, then you see these certain steps that kind of go along the way. And there's the initial kind of thoughts within oneself, and then there's this curiosity about entertaining those thoughts. And we see that as kind of the step that Dorian's currently on. He wants to listen to what Henry and his, you know, bad ideas have to say. It's interesting that Lord Henry has this beautiful voice, because that is his weapon, that is his scalpel, that is his power, is his voice throughout this whole thing. Any power that he has socially, any power that he has over Dorian is all through his ability to speak not only with a beautiful voice, but with these alluring words that really play up those thoughts that people had within themselves to begin with. So Henry immediately starts throwing out these paradoxical epigrams, which is kind of interesting that he speaks in a way that is reminiscent of some of the way that Oscar Wilde himself speaks, and I don't think here is the place, but Oscar Wilde kind of identified himself in a way with all three of these characters as he was writing this, and he talked about that. But let's carry on. This is such a full chapter that it's easy to take quite a bit of time. So Lord Henry starts talking about how it's, you know, to influence somebody is to give that person a piece of their own soul. And really the best thing to do is to live fully, completely being yourself and not being parts of other people. So let me give you a good example of what I'm talking about here. Lord Henry says, by the way, in a low musical voice, so there's that sense of, you know, temptation drawing Dorian in. I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal. But the bravest man among us is afraid of himself. He goes on to say a little further into this just very fluid kind of, you know, sermon on behalf of self, that the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. What a comment. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. The bravest man among us is afraid of himself. He makes a lot of claims here. We're not going to peel apart every comment that Henry makes, or else we would be on this book forever and ever, but there are a few things that are important to notice here. Let's start with that temptation piece. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. So these are the internal temptations, right? Those things that people want to do, wish they could do, that kind of thing in context. And Henry's claim is that these temptations, they'll linger your entire life, and you'll kind of wonder what if, unless you give in to that temptation. It's an incredibly poisonous idea if you think about the kinds of things that people are sometimes tempted to do. There are ways to circumvent that. However, by putting this idea into young Dorian's mind, he's 20 at this point, it gets Dorian thinking here in a moment, what are some of those temptations that I've had? By connecting the idea of fear, that men are afraid of themselves, it almost, you know, if you follow the sort of twisted logic of Lord Henry, it's almost as if it takes courage to yield to temptation, to get rid of it. It's this very, you know, backwards sounding sort of thing. It is very much like the serpent in the garden, Paradise Lost, you know, have the courage to go against the established rules and all of that. And he's also connecting this giving into temptation as being yourself fully. We actually hear some variations of this philosophy going on right now. If you listen carefully, sometimes you can hear like, well, you know, whatever it is you want to do, regardless of what that might be, you know, just be yourself, without regard to, you know, basic morality or ethics, or, you know, kind of the better thing to do. And so Henry is just talking away, just getting Dorian to lean in and to consider, what would it mean to give in to every thought that I've had, or you know, is that really courage? So Henry kind of starts to go in for the kill, not quite, but he starts to go in for the kill at the end of that speech that I read a bunch of. He says, "You, Mr. Gray, you yourself, with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, You have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams, whose mere memory might stain your cheek with shame. Stop, faltered Dorian Gray, stop, you bewilder me. I don't know what to say. There is some answer to you, but I cannot find it. Don't speak, let me think, or rather, let me try not to think. So he's really gotten under Dorian's skin here. He literally says, nope, it's too much. My mind is just spinning at this point with all these things that apparently Henry has hit a nerve and is right about a lot of the things that he's saying in terms of what Dorian has thought. So yes, this is all building to a kind of how far can I push this level with Lord Henry, and he's delighted to have so much influence. He wants to tempt, he wants to draw Dorian into that more id-like state. We get a bit from Dorian's perspective after this, where he thinks mere words, how terrible they were, how much power is in words, that kind of thing. And Henry is just playing Dorian like a piece of music, basically. He's speaking and speaking in this mellifluous voice, and then he's silent and lets Dorian just stew and kind of get heightened to that next level where he can continue to poison Dorian with his ideas. Interestingly, Basil at this point is painting, and he says, oh, Dorian, you're being so still. It's a wonderful expression on your face. And he is so absorbed in his painting that he literally has not been listening to this conversation at all. He doesn't know the things that Henry has been saying. It's like Basil is on this other plane. He's doing this, he's creating this beautiful art. If you remember from last video, Oscar Wilde thinks of beauty as the highest, as the best thing that life has to offer. And so again, we see Basil as this kind of superego character who's very excited about this piece of art. He says, this is going to be my masterpiece. All right, so as he's finishing up this painting, Dorian and Lord Henry go out into the garden, and now that Dorian is taken away and isolated, Lord Henry is able to exert even more influence over him. And he begins right away with this almost, seductive way of approaching Dorian. So it says, Lord Henry went out into the garden and found Dorian Gray burying his face in the great cool lilac blossoms, feverishly drinking in their perfume as if it had been wine. So Dorian already has this penchant for really soaking up beauty, not only being beautiful himself, but really luxuriating in the excessive beauties all around him. That's really so much of what this book is. So Lord Henry sees this, he comes up to him, he puts his hand on his shoulder and says, you are quite right to do that. So you are the one with the power, is what he says or implies with his words. You are right in what you're doing. And then he goes on, he says, nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul. So here we get the first, or one of the first mentions of soul, which is a key concept in this as well going forward, but it's the senses. It's indulging the senses that is the good thing that Dorian's doing, connecting back to what Henry was saying about the courage that it takes to do whatever you want, to, just live in this kind of hedonism, basically. The pleasure is the highest idea. They talk for a bit, and then Lord Henry drops this bombshell. He says, you have the most marvelous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having. He goes on to deliver this entire monologue about how youth, how beauty is the only and the best thing. It's a twisted version of Oscar Wilde's own philosophy. And to me, it seems like he's kind of not only writing a beautiful, you know, story, but he's also thinking through his own philosophy in a way, or maybe not examining it in a purely logical sense, but, you know, kind of putting it against the light in these different ways and seeing what comes out. So some of what Lord Henry says about beauty is what I think Oscar Wilde would say about it, but then he goes and takes a step so far that I doubt Wilde would support what Lord Henry is saying to Dorian. So he says, beauty is the only thing worth having. Time will make you, you know, hideous. You won't be able to do the things, to have the things that you once did. You're going to suffer. And he ends this whole speech by saying, live the wonderful life that is in you. Let nothing be lost upon you. Be always searching for new sensations, right? Those sensations that he mentioned at the beginning of this interaction were so good. Be afraid of nothing. It takes courage to indulge yourself to this degree. He's echoing all these things he said before. A new hedonism. That is what our century wants. You might be its visible symbol. With your personality, there is nothing you could not do. The world belongs to you for a season. And then skipping to the very end of this speech, we never get back our youth. The pulse of joy that beats in us at 20 becomes sluggish. Our limbs fail, our senses rot. We degenerate into hideous puppets, haunted by the memory of the passions of which we were too much afraid and the exquisite temptations that we had not the courage to yield to. He just comes out and says it overtly now. Youth, youth, there is absolutely nothing in the world but youth. So, my gosh, if he had opened with this statement, I think Dorian probably would have seen it for what it was. You know, have the courage to give in to every temptation that you've ever had. I think Dorian would have said, what? I mean, clearly he's thought some, you know, some nasty things, you know, those thoughts that kind of come and go, right? But Lord Henry is a master here. He set the stage, and then he does all of these brilliant salesman tactics. Not only does he have this wonderful, eloquent way of speaking, but he introduces this, you know, only for a limited time element where it's like, it's now or never, and that will often get people to buy into ideas or literally just buy something because the opportunity just won't last. So he is layering all of these influential tactics, one on top of another, to see if he can get Dorian to believe him. Dorian is this beautiful, supreme experiment in Lord Henry's mind. He does not care about Basil. He is focused on this young man, and despite what he said earlier about like being completely yourself, Lord Henry is really the one who's steering this ship now with Dorian. So it says Dorian Gray listened to what Henry said, open-eyed and wondering. The spray of lilac fell from his hand upon the gravel. This, to me, connects to a couple of things. This connects to chapter 1, where Henry is pulling apart that daisy as he's listening to Basil. So that symbol of beauty and purity, he's just pulling it apart. Here, Dorian himself drops that flower, that symbol. And there's an almost identical line in Paradise Lost by John Milton about the fall of man, when Adam realizes that Eve has been you know, tempted by the serpent. He says that this flower garland he was putting together down dropped. So this is a pretty common symbol, and it's very obviously symbolic of this fall from, you know, purity and grace that Dorian is experiencing by accepting the words of Lord Henry. Lord Henry gets even, he just builds in strength with all the things he's saying. He starts using the power of suggestion by saying, "You're glad to have met me, Mr. Gray," instead of allowing Dorian to come up with that thought first. And Dorian is like, "Yes, yes." And Dorian even starts kind of flirting back with Lord Henry. We see a lot of that kind of interaction throughout this entire story with almost every character to one another, but we see it pretty overtly here when he says, "I am glad to have met you. I hope that our friendship can last," essentially. And the way he says it is pretty clearly, you know, he's sort of shy about it. Okay, so then we get to the moment, that inciting incident that I was talking about. All this temptation has led up to the moment of decision that's going to affect the entire rest of the story. The two of them come in from the garden. They see that Basil's portrait of Dorian, the picture of Dorian Gray, is completed, and the sense of Dorian's own fleeting beauty comes up. It just hits him like this freight train, and he thinks to himself, all of these things are going to pass away. All of this is not going to last, and it just breaks his heart. It freaks him out, and he thinks the life that was to make his soul would mar his body. He would become dreadful, hideous, and uncouth. It's an interesting comment because once again we get this idea of soul. So the life that was to make his soul, so something that the experiences that can make his soul better would make his body worse. But at that moment he decides which of those two he would prefer to preserve. And it's that external beauty. It's that body rather than the soul. And he says, if you have not been paying attention to my quotations up to now, I don't know why you would not, but this is the one. How sad it is. He's looking at the picture. How sad it is, murmured Dorian Gray, with his eyes still fixed upon his own portrait. How sad it is. I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful, but this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If it were only the other way, if it were I who was to be always young and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. Yes, there's nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that. I would give my soul to be as beautiful as that portrait forever and ever. This is the moment. This is the deal with the devil right here. Some sort of magic occurs in this moment that affects the rest of the story and makes Dorian and this portrait linked together. Basil, of course, objects to this comment. Henry does not. He's jealous of a picture that does not have life just because it has this external beauty to it. So Basil objects to this reaction so strongly that he says, this is nonsense. This is terrible. I do not want this much pain to come out of my work. I'd rather destroy it. You matter to me more than this does, because again, Basil's a very decent person. And so Basil grabs a knife and he is going to rip this canvas, but it's Dorian who runs up and says, "Don't, Basil, don't," he cried. "It would be murder," which is just such an interesting comment. It would be murder to slash this portrait. It's like that's his life. His life is that beauty, and that's all. So do remember that quote. "I am glad you appreciate my work at last, Dorian," said the painter coldly when he had recovered from his surprise. "I never thought you would." "Appreciate it," Dorian responds. "I am in love with it, Basil. It is part of myself. I feel that." Okay, so Basil is disenchanted with this picture and the reaction that it's caused, but Dorian is in love with it. This is that narcissist element. We see just like the mythological character, that he's in love with his own image. They have a discussion about which one is the real Dorian. Is it the picture? Is it the person? And then the chapter ends with two invitations. There's Basil inviting Dorian to dine with him, and then Lord Henry inviting Dorian to go to the theater with him. So it's that angel and devil. One is saying go this way, one is saying go the other way. And Dorian ultimately decides to go with Lord Henry, to Basil's great sadness. So thank you for sticking around. I know that was a longer video than usual, but it's such a pivotal chapter that I'm not going to apologize. Instead, if you want any additional resources for Dorian Gray, be sure to head over to my website, carly-stevens.com. Like this video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe to English Nerd for all things English nerdy goodness, and I'll see you next time.